In this video, I'm going to show you solutions to the Check Your Understanding for Section 14, Topic 1. These were not covered in the video you watched, so I wanted to make sure that you get an understanding of what's happening here. So a few things that we need to know is we're simplifying this, so it's going to be a little tricky. So for this one, what we need to know is that tangent of x is equal to sine of x over cosine of x. Secant is equal to 1 over cosine. And remember from the Pythagorean identity, sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x equals 1. So those are some identities we kind of need to know, and we're going to substitute it throughout. So first things first, I am going to rewrite this so sine and cosine are right next to each other. So what that looks like is sine squared x plus cosine squared of x plus tangent squared of x divided by secant of x. Okay, so based on this first identity right here, I can substitute in 1 for sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x. So right here, I am going to replace that with the number 1. So I get 1 plus tangent squared of x divided by secant of x. Okay? Now from here, I'm going to use what we know about tangent and substitute it in. So that's this one right here. So tangent is equal to sine over x divided by cosine of x. So I have 1 plus, because it's tangent squared, it's going to be sine squared of x divided by cosine squared of x. And it's still all being divided by secant of x. Okay? From here, what we need to do is I'm going to rewrite this 1 so it has a common denominator of cosine squared of x. So what that looks like is cosine squared of x divided by cosine squared of x plus sine squared of x divided by cosine squared of x. And it's still all over secant of x. Okay, so now that I have that, my fractions, I can go ahead and add these. Okay, the denominator stays the same. It's cosine squared of x. On top, I have cosine squared of x plus sine squared of x. Cosine squared of x plus sine squared of x. Still being divided by secant of x. Well, again, I have cosine plus sine, and they're both being squared. That's this first one up here. It just equals 1. So I'm going to replace that. So I have 1 over cosine squared of x divided by secant of x. Okay, well, I did have a identity up here at the top that secant is 1 over cosine. Well, if you look, I have 1 over cosine squared. So what that tells me is this part right here turns into secant squared of x divided by secant of x. Well, secant squared of x can be expanded as secant of x times secant of x, and we're dividing it by secant of x. So one secant cancels out a secant on the bottom, and I'm just left with secant of x. So my answer is answer C. Okay, so this is my answer right here. I know, it's a lot of work. Okay, so let's look at the second question. So the second question, can't see it, okay, is talking about 1 plus tangent squared of x divided by cosecant squared of x. So let's see what we need to remember on this one. Again, tangent is sine over cosine. Cosecant is 1 over sine. Okay, so that's what we need to learn for this one. So let's take a look at this. I am going to replace this tangent squared of x right here with this sine over cosine, and since it's squared, we have to make sure that it's squared on our end. So I have, oops, dropping my pencil, 1 plus sine squared of x divided by cosine squared of x. It's still all being divided by cosecant squared of x. Okay. Again, I am going to need to change this 1 so it has a common denominator with this cosine like I did in the last question. So what that changes to is cosine squared of x divided by cosine squared of x. That equals 1. It's still being added to sine squared of x divided by cosine squared of x all over cosecant squared of x. I know, it's a lot. Okay, so from here, I'm going to add these. They have a common denominator, so I'm going to add. So I get cosine squared of x plus sine squared of x, all divided by cosine squared of x. And then that is being divided by cosecant squared of x. Okay, so what we learned in the last video, 1 is equal to cosine squared plus sine squared. So I'm going to substitute that for a 1. So I get 1 over cosine of x divided by cosecant squared of x. Okay, so this is where we're going to use what we learned with cosecant. Cosecant is 1 over sine. That's what I have written up here. So cosecant is 1 over sine, this part. So I am going to substitute 1 over sine for this cosecant squared. So I have 1 over cosine squared of x divided by 1 over sine squared of x. Now, we all know we don't like having fractions divided by fractions, so we multiply by the reciprocal, or we keep, change, flip. So multiply by the reciprocal, keep, change, flip. What that means is we keep this first one the same. It's going to say 1 over cosine squared of x. We multiply, or we change from division to multiplication. So multiplication. And we flip this, or we make it the reciprocal, which is just sine squared over x over 1. So sine squared of x over 1. And then we just multiply straight across because they are fractions. So I do 1 times sine squared of x. I get sine squared of x. On the bottom, I do cosine squared of x times 1, which leaves me with cosine squared of x. Well, we know sine over cosine is tangent. So sine squared of x over cosine squared of x is just tangent squared of x. We look at our answer choices, and that's answer choice A. So A would be our answer choice. Yes, I know this is a lot of work. Okay, let's take a look at the third question that they ask us. So we have 1 minus sine squared of x divided by 1 plus sine of x. Now, typically, we would just try to substitute in, because we know 1 minus sine squared of x is cosine, but that really doesn't do much for us because the bottom part is not being squared. So what I need you to understand is 1 is a perfect squared, sine squared is a perfect square, and I'm subtracting them. This is a difference of squares. So this right here is a difference of squares. Which means we're going to factor. Yes, your favorite thing to do. So a difference of squares is if I have two perfect things squared and I'm subtracting them, to factor it, I take the square root of the first one, and that goes in the first spot in my parentheses. I take the square root of the second term, that goes in the second spot in my parentheses, and from here, I add 1, I subtract 1. So that's what we're going to do here. So I have the square root of 1, which is 1, so 1 goes in both spots here. The square root of sine squared is sine of x, sine of x, 1 plus, 1 minus. And that's still all over 1 plus sine of x. Well, if you look on top and bottom, I have a 1 plus sine x, 1 plus sine x. Those cancel each other out, and it just leaves me with 1 minus sine of x. Well, that's all I have left. I look at my answer choices, and that looks like it's answer choice D. Okay, so this is for the test yourself on section 14, topic 1. So I hope you watch this before you do the test yourself. If you have any questions, please just reach out to me, join a tutoring session, anything like that.